With that, I'll hand it over to Mr. Andrew Alaniz, Director of Enterprise Technology Risk for Freddie Mac. A lot of you may know him from his years of a lot of really progressive work at BBVA. We're very appreciative to have his vision here in town. Andrew also drove, kind of anchored and launched the concept of our security panel conversation last year, which was a pretty big hit. So we're very excited to welcome him back. And by the way, big thanks for him jumping in, last minute with us to pull together this presentation for you guys today. So Andrew, thanks a lot. All yours.
Hey, thanks, Jeremy. I told Jeremy a little earlier, I actually made 2 presentations for this because I couldn't decide which way to take it. So looking at the, let's see, can you see my screen okay there?
Yep.
All right, cool. So looking at the crowd, since it's a little smaller, let's definitely make this a conversation. So don't leave me hanging as the only one talking today. So as Jeremy said, I've been in the Birmingham scene for about 15 years now. And generally been a technologist, everything from sysadmin to security to leading product and engineering teams for a global bank. And so I've experienced a number of areas within an organization that deal with risk management. And the reality is none of us can escape it, but we all have to deal with it a little differently. So kind of what I wanted to talk about was how should we as technologists, as engineers, as developers be thinking about risk management and maybe some things that we didn't realize before. Because, if you're not aware, I've kind of gone over to the dark side, right? I'm no longer in technology from a hands-on standpoint. I'm in risk management and second line. For those that aren't familiar, this is pretty prevalent in the financial industry, is the idea of 3 lines of defense. You've got your first line, which is your technology teams, sometimes often augmented by an IT risk team. Then you've got second line, which is oversight to the risk management of those teams. And then third line is audit. The methodology has its pros and cons. I'm not here to debate that really. But what I wanted to talk about was like now that I'm almost 5 months in at Freddie, what I've seen from a mature risk management function and what I've seen over my career as what risk management looks like to engineering teams. I kind of want to talk through how we should be interacting, right? Probably some of you work at an organization that doesn't have a dedicated, lines of defense risk function. You may have some auditors, you may have some risk analysts. So I think we're probably going to run the gambit on kind of how you would interact with those teams. But the reality is the accountability for the things that we run as technologists still lies with us. We need to understand the risk and what that means, and we need to manage that. And that doesn't just mean turning on the security controls. So there we go. So starting with understanding risk, like I think it's important that at an organization for sure, but at the very least in the technology teams, you need to have a strategy for what it means to manage risk. I'm a huge Phil Venables fan. If you're not familiar with him, he's the CISO at Google. And he puts a lot of good content out there about risk management and security. One of the blog posts that I really love is risk management is not only about reducing risks. There are acceptable levels of risk that are not necessarily less, right? And there's other things that we can do. We can make things more efficient. We can automate things. Sometimes based on the nature of the business, we have to take on risk in order to further the mission of the business. And so risk management is not just about making sure there's no risk. That's actually really easy to do. Just go unplug the network cables and you have just about no risk. But that's not what we want to do. And so I wanted to kind of talk a minute here about if you're dealing with risk management teams, like what are they thinking? So they're thinking in terms of 3 things: inherent risk, controls, and residual risk. And so for those of you that may not be familiar with that concept, essentially inherent risk is understanding and attempting to quantify what, if I had no controls in place, what is the risk of me doing a thing? So as an example, I have a public facing application in AWS. Making a web server exposed publicly to the internet in and of itself is not necessarily a high inherent risk, but that could change based on the type of data that it has access to, based on the impact to an organization of the reputation if something were to happen to it, based on how often or how available it needs to be. Those things adjust the inherent risk. And then we need to apply controls to mitigate risk to an acceptable level. And so, part of that strategy is determining what is that acceptable level. And so, then we take those controls and we kind of look at how they have impacted that inherent risk, and that helps us come up with a residual risk. That residual risk is what ultimately determines whether or not you are within or without your acceptable levels of risk. And without that, engineers, developers, security analysts, like everyone's just basically going off of their opinion of what they think is an acceptable level, and no one's going to agree, and you're not going to have any idea what you're working towards. So I think the point here is that even technology teams, in the absence of a risk team, but if there are risk teams in collaboration with them, need to understand what is your strategy for managing risk and what is the acceptable level of risk. The risk appetite is the term that you would use for the organization, and the scope of what you're covering. So as an example, if you've got maybe you're doing some data analytics and the lines of business kind of control what that data analytics outputs. IT and technology may not control the risk related to whether or not that function calculates its information correctly. And so that's where scope's important, understanding like where's your area of responsibility. And the business value in the data is big to me because it's really easy, and I think we all know as technologists, for us to over-engineer the crap out of everything we do. And so, we're already constantly like holding ourselves back. No, I don't need to go that far, or that's too much. When it comes to risk management, it can be the same thing. Like if we try to quantify everything down to single dollars, like all you're going to do is risk management arguments, right? On who's right, who can make the best case for something. And there's no need to go to that level. And so it just depends on the organization at what level, but you've got to decide like how much do we care? How far do we need to go? Can we just keep it high level? Do we need to go a little bit deeper, or do we need to go like full blown quantify everything? And I think there's a business case for each of those, but I think ultimately here, you got to understand what is the risk language, inherent risk, residual risk, and what is your strategy? Because everything else determines that. Otherwise, you're literally just kind of throwing money at the wind, guessing that you're doing the right thing. I'm gonna stop there for a second. Any questions? All right, I'm gonna call on somebody at some point and make you ask me a question. All right, so the next thing is understanding your landscape. And what I mean by this is throughout my career, I have had plenty of experience with someone telling me, oh yeah, we do this, right? But then when you start asking 2 or 3 questions more, it's like, well, that actually only applies to like 25% of our environment because everything else is shit. And I think the important thing here is that may or may not be the case. That's somebody's opinion. If you don't assess it and measure it, you don't really know that. And just because something's older technology, just because something's not done the way you want it to be done, just because something is running in VMware and not EKS, doesn't mean it's inherently risky. A lot of times there's a business value proposition for doing that offsets any additional risk that can also be mitigated other ways. And so what I'm trying to say here is it's really important for us to understand what the landscape is. where is our scope and where do we care about? Did we know that development team installed Docker on their EC2 instances is managing their own containers? Maybe we thought that we had a centralized EKS cluster that was being managed by our internal teams, but we gave it a development team too much control, and they kind of went off on a tangent there. Did we know that when you go into Mongo Atlas, there's no control available in the organization, in the tool, to prevent someone from setting up a database hosted in APAC? Are we aware of that, or did we just let the development teams go off and set up Mongo Atlas because they needed a database and we didn't have anybody to support it? Did we know that we didn't have permission boundaries configured for our IAM roles, and we gave a DevOps team an admin role, and they created more users so that they could access it from home without having to go through the VPN? These are things that we need to be aware of from a risk standpoint, because what they really are telling, what the story is really telling, is that there's some process that's either missing or broken that people are working around, and it's really something that IT needs to understand, because there's nothing worse, in my opinion, than IT having a strategy and then someone in risk coming by and saying, hey, but you got an issue here and it's high and you got to fix it now. And then everything you planned for the next 6 months just got shot. So what we need to do as technologists is understand what risk managers are thinking and actually just start managing risk ourselves. Because if we can do that, we can circumvent and we can be preventative to those conversations. And so that's something that I'm becoming really passionate about. Is risk management's essential, but it's gotten a bad rap over time because it's so unplanned. It causes a lot of unplanned work. And there's a disconnect between the perceived business value from technology and the perceived business value from risk management. And ultimately, we need to collaborate more.
Hey, Andrew, Jeremy, if you
Yep.
don't mind me jump in for a second. So you bring up, I was going to ask one question. You kind of answered it, but added to it. You bring up a great point about sort of managing, certainly there's the business drivers, opportunities, cost, everything that's going to drive technology forward from a purely business context and bridging that with the priorities of tech, but also sort of infecting this understanding, baking in risk management thinking into a dev operation, and some of the disconnects there of, perhaps even becoming adversarial sometimes of why is risk management, beating on me about this. As somebody who's been into, very large, industries that aren't always by their nature focused on the tech, maybe, any thoughts on how you drive that from a conversational standpoint, how you drive that communication and knowledge gap of, line of business isn't always going to necessarily understand the technology and the risks inherent in that. Technology isn't always versed in the risks and consequences. So you've got not just a need to have those conversations, but, mitigating the differences in perspective and, vernacular even in doing that. You want maybe any thoughts on that to share? Or this would be a great one for other, I see, looking across the participants, people in other organizations here. I think that's probably that sort of ongoing dynamic of advocating multiple perspectives and, balancing and communication probably affects everybody. That would, anybody else want to weigh in kind of with what you've seen there and how you've dealt with that?
Yeah, I'll see if anybody wants to jump in, and then I'll respond.
And by the way, Justin is throwing out Uber Eats gift cards for questions and participants. So if we've got to bribe you, we are not above it.
Do me a favor, Jeremy, if you'll watch the chat, because it's not playing well with my screen.
Okay. Yep. Gotcha.
Yeah. So I'll jump in with a couple of thoughts. I think there's two challenges that, and they're related, that make this complicated, but I think I have a solution. One is that traditionally there's not a lot of technology talent in risk management. and there's not a lot of drive for technologists to join risk management. And on the flip side, there's not a lot of risk management experience and knowledge in technology. There is understanding of certain types of risk, but not necessarily how to quantify and how to measure those in technology. And so I think from the technology standpoint, we're not going to be able to solve the talent problem in risk management. But what we can do is, ultimately risk management needs to move to a continuous compliance type model where we're not going and doing point in time assessments, because at the speed of cloud, the second we start a point in time assessment, it's changed. And so we're working off of stale data. And so from a technology standpoint, I think it's essential that technologists understand the language of risk management and start anticipating the questions they're going to ask and the things they want to know, so that, one, we can provide them with self-service data and information, and two, the questions they're asking should be legitimate questions that we should already be asking ourselves. And so I think what it boils down to me is that if there's something I expect in my environment, I should be able to programmatically measure it, and it should give me a piece of information. That metric and piece of information is not there to answer the question, is my environment secure? What it is there to answer is this thing I expect happening? And whether it is or not is informing the risk of my environment. So as an example, do I have any public S3 buckets? Let's just use that. Generally, the answer should be no, because there are other ways to expose the data in an S3 bucket without making it public. And as a large enterprise, I would expect that to be zero. But maybe there's a legitimate reason for something. But the reality is, I should know as a practitioner how many public S3 buckets I have in my environment. And if that ever changes, that's a red flag. And so I think I can all name those kind of things all day. And that's why I put this little comment in the bottom. If you're not aware, SHTF, shit hits the fan. Like, what are the things that I know that if this ever happens in my environment, it should be all hands on deck? And the reality is, if my CSOC, if my SOC, if my, whatever team is drowning in alerts, man, just turn them off. Focus on those alerts. If they're not adding value, like, we don't need to know if CrowdStrike, I identified something malicious that happened immediately, if it actually resolved the issue. Yeah, we definitely need to go investigate it. But I need to know if CrowdStrike saw an action that it didn't stop, right? That's more important. And so we need to be weighing, are these things that we're looking at and responding to immediately valuable? Or is it something that we can kind of triage? Tyrone.
How you doing?
Good.
Okay, my question, you talked about S3 buckets not being publicly exposed, and there were some other ways of doing it. Can you kind of go into detail with that? One of the things that I'm kind of thinking about with risk management is I think it's called the military zones or something like that on the networking side. Is there anything like that with AWS?
So that is a loaded question. My suggestion is that depending on your size, I would definitely have this conversation with your SA. If you don't have an SA, I'm sure our AWS folks can, have some conversations with you about that, or point you to some information. But what I would say there is that the term you're looking for is DMZs, demilitarized zone. And at its core, it's an older construct based on a kind of a perimeter type network. That pretty much goes away when you're talking cloud, depending on how you architect. It's still possible to do that. The concept is the same in that you want these areas that reduce the attack surface, But the reality is there's about 20 different ways that you can do that in AWS, depending on the situation and the architecture. And I would be doing you a disservice. Not that I can't go into the detail, but I'd be doing you a disservice to give you like a specific way to do it without knowing the entire context. John, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think John might not be.
No, yeah,
on-
we can, if he wants to reach out to some of the AWS guys afterwards, we can reach out to him and talk to him more.
Cool. So yeah, Tyrone, definitely not trying to like push you off, but if I told you one thing and I don't have all the information, I could tell you something wrong, and that one thing may not apply to the other people on the call. So there's just too many kind of variations to that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And
Anybody else?
John had brought up a question in chat. John, I'm not sure if you're tied up otherwise, so I'll read this off to Andrew unless you want to.
No, yeah, go for it.
Okay, so John asks, if you're in an organization that doesn't have a mature risk management team, what frameworks or tools would you recommend, specifically around bringing up and cataloging risks identified through, by people throughout the org?
So that's a good question. And unfortunately, I would say there's actually a ton of them that you could choose from. For cloud, honestly, I think I would start simple. And if we're talking, like, let's say we're talking AWS specifically, I would just turn on Security Hub and AWS foundational controls. And I would look at that. If we're talking broader enterprise, you're going to want to expand that a little bit. Cloud Security Alliance has the cloud control matrix that's available, and that's probably a good standard one. And then, like NIST is a little behind in cloud specific, but they are coming out with some good work in conjunction with CISA and NSA. MITRE ATT&CK framework's another one I would consider. The challenge is, if you're not going to have a dedicated risk management program, I would follow the KISS principle. Keep it simple, and really trying to adopt something like one of those, while is valuable, may be counterintuitive if you're trying to do that on top of your day job of building and operating. And so what I would advise is, if you're having to wear both hats, focus on identifying those things that you expect in your environment, and make sure that at any given moment on demand, you can determine if those things you expect to happen are happening. And so maybe one other caveat to that would be, think about scenarios. What are the scenarios that concern you the most? Maybe it's ransomware, maybe it's an outside attacker, and think about those things that you expect that apply to those, and create yourself a scenario-based dashboard for each of those that gives you all of those metrics that inform that risk posture. I would not try and boil it down to a single number in any of those cases. You're going to need a couple of different things to measure that. I think that would be my response. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks for the feedback on that one, and John and Tyrone for the questions. Anyone else? This is great so far. Any other questions, any directions anybody wants to take this conversation?
Hey guys, I'll toss one at you. My name is Joshua. So Andrew, I've got a question, since it seems like you've been on both sides of the world, right? Doing risk management and operations, various things like that. And I can absolutely echo your experience and say that there is often a disconnect between, let's say, just generalize it to ops and risk management. What are your suggestions to try to bridge those gaps, or what's worked for you in the past?
Yeah, so I think one, and I can, on the operations side, as you say, is learning the language and forcing more proactive conversations, like as opposed to waiting for the assessment to come. Like, let's have a regular cadence, because just from a soft, like a sociological standpoint, we often define the relationships with people in the situations where we interact the most. And so if your only interaction with the risk management teams is when there's assessment and everybody's stressed and everybody's baby's being called ugly, and now you've got 14 issues that you've got to respond to, then the relationship's going to be defined by this person brings me stress and I'm defensive and I don't want to deal with it. And so just from a relationship standpoint, one, I would build non-work related relationships. And I don't even mean outside of work, just have coffee chats with the risk management folks. And then I would set up regular cadences with them to talk about, hey, here's some of the risks we're dealing with. Can you guys help us? Because the reality is, if you can get synergies between risk and IT, maybe there's areas where it's like, hey, we're spending all this money on A, but we really need to be focusing on B. Risk can help bubble those up, and they can help bubble up things like, we don't have the people to adequately deal with this. They can provide that semi-objective, depending on how you're structured, a view of that. And then from the risk management side, I'll tell you what I'm doing in a couple of areas is I've aligned our planning and work with our operations teams, PIs and sprints, so that, and I've set a goal for next year that I'm not going to create any unplanned work for our operations teams around assessments. So what that means is I'm having to manage my team and plan our work for next year so that I know when things are going to happen, and make sure that I'm not conflicting when audit's going to come on or they're planning some feature release. Because if they're planning a feature release for X and I want to assess X, I'm going to wait until later in the year and not do it while they're changing it. The other piece is I'm trying to move our teams away from any kind of point in time assessment. And so one of the outcomes for any kind of assessment that we're doing right now is I want to identify a metric, or at least one metric, that can automate looking at something that we assessed. That way that I can go look at that metric, as opposed to having to go ask a bunch of questions and spend a bunch of time with the operations teams. And so I think from the risk management side, we've got to understand technology and how it works and how those teams work, and create synergies there. And then from the technology side, I think we've got to understand that that's only going to be solved well when technologists are on the risk management side. And so we've got to be willing to lead and train them. And so that's going to take some soft skills of managing up and out.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. And I do like the idea of aligned cadence as well. That seems like it would make things flow a lot more easily.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'll tack one more onto that, and this one may be a little far-reaching. Do you, at least where you are now or in the past, do you ever reach out and interact direct with users, or is it more from the analytical standpoint where you're kind of just watching the data? Because what I've, at least, and I'll tell you honestly, I'm not a risk management person, but I am in operations. And I've found I have bridged a ton of gaps in our technology just by shadowing users and having conversations with what they do. And it kind of harkens back to something you mentioned a little while ago. You look for the things that you don't expect, right? And I generally find those when I'm speaking to end users. I'll see something that's like, whoa, I really didn't see that one coming.
So I can just speak for myself. It depends on what user you're talking about. So my customers would be IT operations teams, and so I'm absolutely talking with them, and I'm asking them, what do you expect to be happening? Where do you think the risk is? Where can I be helpful? How can I help you? And so I think those kind of conversations are essential. I don't know that it would make sense to kind of travel down the line of customers to like third and fourth party customers to my customers necessarily. It could, and that depends on the organization. Like if you're a product company, absolutely. But if you're not, then I think there's probably a little more nuance to that.
Agreed. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yep. So funny enough, I think this is kind of what we're talking about here is how do we measure risk? And I think that's going to get different answers depending on who you ask. Some people are going to say you've got to develop a matrix and a menu that ties your risks to these, probabilities and impacts and things like that. And traditionally that's the case. But I think a lot of those are going to miss many nuances in how you measure risk. And it also makes it difficult to quantify, because that makes it simple to kind of roll up a risk. But then when you have to explain how you got there and whether or not it's high or low, or how doing A, B, and C is going to move it from high to medium, those conversations get complicated when you try to like cookie cutter all of the things. And so I think as technologists, what we need to do is, one, fill out the organization. There's going to be, depending on if you're a regulated entity, you're going to have to do some of that, and there's nothing you can do about it, and you're going to have to work within that construct. But I think you can also do some other things. If you're not, then risk management doesn't have to be that burdensome, right? It could be as simple as, like I said earlier, creating those dashboards. And so we've got to, I think we've got to lead risk management teams in how continuous compliance can work. And I think one of the challenges there is I don't think technology teams understand what that means either. And I think it goes back to, if there's a thing you expect to happen, whether it's an architectural pattern, it's access to only a certain number of services, it's only US East 1 and US West 2 are being used versus other regions, whatever it may be, we need to know when that's not happening, right? And so, a couple of key things I think here. One is, it's okay for a metric to always be 0. Just because we have a preventative control in place doesn't mean I shouldn't measure that, right? Because the reality is a lot of our controls are code and can change. And so if I expect a preventative control to always be there, that metric should always be 0. But as soon as I create a PR that accidentally changed the wrong line of code, or somebody makes a change in a firewall or something like that, then that metric may change, and I should quickly be able to see, hey, that's not right. And I think the other key thing here is we should never try to simplify risk to a single number or a single value. If we do that, we sure better be able to back it up with the data that built up to that, right? And so when I try to, if I'm a technologist and I'm going to say this thing is high risk, how do I know that, one? And if it is that acceptable? I need to know those two things. And then third, if it's not acceptable, I've got to be able to show how doing 1, 2, and 3 things, or whatever that may be, is going to bring it down from high. And if we're not measuring anything, there's no way we can do that. So pause here again, see if anybody's got any questions. All right. All right, so technology, this is another key piece. There's a couple of pieces to this. So risk management tools, and what I mean by that is, the industry would call them GRC tools. In my experience, I've dealt with 2 or 3 different technology suites, are just not up to snuff. They're hard to use. They're way over customized. They're trying to fit a graph-based relationship into a relational database, and it's just hard, and it's kind of clunky. And so those tools have got to catch up to API-driven dynamic relationships between risks, controls, processes, all those kind of things. That's one of the challenges there. And if you're in a regulated company, you probably have experience with some of those tools and you understand that. In the absence of this, you're actually kind of blessed that you don't have to deal with those tools. You still need to be proactive in how you prove risk or controls. Just because you say we've reduced that risk, how do you know? You've got to be able to prove it. You've got to have the data. You've got to show that. And so I think a couple of questions that both technologists and risk managers should be asking themselves is, one, how can we automate our assessments? Like, what value is going and asking someone if something is effective, adding that a metric couldn't show us? And if we had more of those, then the conversations that we have could be a lot more productive. And two, how can technology teams make that information more self-service? So how many of you running an AWS environment can quickly, and I would say quickly, I would say within 5 minutes, go tell me how many EC2 instances you have, and if they all have your expected tags. And maybe for some of you, I should ask, do you know what tags you expect your servers to have? And then let's take it up a step or up a notch. Of all of those EC2s that maybe you know where they are, how many of them have sensitive data on them? How many of them are properly architected with the right level of resiliency for the expected RTO for those systems, right? Those are like the second and third questions that a risk manager or risk analyst is going to ask. We should anticipate that and have the data available, because the reality is we should know which of your AWS accounts is your riskiest and why. If you don't know that off the top of your head, to be honest, that's probably something you should go figure out. So this one's a little tougher. I think it puts a lot more onus on the technology teams, as it should. But I would love to hear some feedback and thoughts on that, because I'm hoping maybe that one piques some curiosity there. Come on, somebody's got to have something.
Anyone? Come on. Uber Eats, let's go.
All right. So we talked about this a little bit. I think I've covered this, and I think this might be my last slide. Yeah. So I think that covers all the content I have. So we still got some time. Let's just kind of open it up for conversation. I would really love your thoughts, because I'm assuming everybody on here touches AWS in some way, whether you're a developer, an IT administrator, or an architect of some kind. I'm assuming that's the majority of the folks on here. How are you addressing knowing some of those questions that I asked?
We've got a great spread of organizations represented in industries and organizations today. So, to echo Andrew's sentiment, it would be terrific to turn this into a little bit of a conversation. If anybody wants to share your thoughts and experiences, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, at Trend Micro, we make a posture management solution. Is there anyone using something like that, some kind of tool that kind of looks at your accounts and tells you your exposure? Have you had any experience with tools like that, Andrew?
I have. So, I've Trend Micro, Prisma, which is Apollo, Cloud Aware is kind of more in asset management, but has some of that. Divi Clouds atop. You've got Lightspin, you've got the other one I was thinking of escapes me.
Is Lacework, is that one of them?
Yeah, Lacework is one, and I think there's a distinction between kind of like the big commercial ones, and then there's some smaller niche kind of small business type that kind of have different strengths and weaknesses. And I think that one danger is turning those on and expecting they're going to do everything for you, because there's a ceiling to the number of things that are equal across all AWS environments, right, or cloud environments. Then above that, there's all the customization that only applies to your organization. And so, making sure that as you adopt those, they're all going to do very similar things. Are you taking them to the next level? Are you watching those things that aren't out of the box? I will say, Justin, to plug for you guys, I really like the output from, what's your service or your tool that outputs this is exactly how you fix this?
Yeah,
Is it cloud conformity?
it's conformity. It'll give you
Yeah.
the CLI and it'll also give you the
Yep.
console.
I really like that feature.
So I guess more since this is an AWS group, when do you know to get away from using the native AWS tools to maybe do leverage a third-party tool, or is it? I'm sure there's like 50 different ways to answer it, but you know, kind of where.
I mean, I think that's the age-old build versus buy, right? I think that there is significant value in outsourcing the support and development of a tool, but at the same time, you're always going to want, like if you're fully utilizing something, you're always going to want that one more thing. And so I think the question is, are you willing to partner and work with that vendor, and are they willing to partner and work with you to influence that roadmap? Or is it better for you because you have such strict regulations, you have such high expectations, whatever it may be, to just do it yourself? And so I think that's really going to be a talent and a capacity problem. And I think everybody probably struggles with that more than either they're able to change or than their leadership thinks. And so I would generally say that it's probably better to identify a tool that does most of that for you.
And you made me think of a great idea since we're talking about risk. When do you know to stick with the regular public cloud or to go into like Azure Gov Cloud? Because you know there's different ways, because with the Gov Cloud a lot of things are a lot more locked down, so you would think your risk would be smaller theoretically.
Maybe I'll let John take that one. I think my opinion would be it would be about the data classification and what you're trying to protect, because from a pure technology standpoint, I wouldn't want to arbitrarily prevent myself from using certain services just because they're not available in GovCloud. And I don't know that. I think most of the things that are in GovCloud that you can't find in non-Gov Cloud really only tie to federal entities and secret classified type data, because otherwise you can build it in traditional AWS.
Yeah, we have a lot of for-profit companies in Huntsville and in Mobile that actually build in the Gov Cloud because they have a lot of federal customers. And so I'm always trying to, and I hate the government cloud because like you were saying, a lot of stuff doesn't work in the Gov Cloud.
Yeah.
Like it does in the
and
public cloud.
probably a lot of that is tied to CMMC and a lot of the certification around that. I think a lot of the danger that's going to come from that too, though, is just like with any other third party. If you're not aware of this, I have in my past had vendors come to me and say, here's AWS's SOC 2, I'm SOC 2 certified. And that's completely not the case. Like, so I'm afraid that I look at CMMC kind of like that. I think they're oversimplifying what AWS provides in a lot of those cases.
Yeah, because you kind of feel like it's redundant to bring up the shared responsibility model, but a lot of people don't understand the shared responsibility model.
Exactly. Yep.